So we talked last week, just as a short recap, using the book, the Marcus Borg and Dominic Crossan book, the last week. I brought up something that was not familiar to everybody. That we started with the final week. We started with Palm Sunday, and Jesus is entering to Jerusalem, and the way we know it from the Gospels is Jesus sends the disciples ahead to find a colt or a donkey, or a colt, the foal of a donkey, to ride in Jerusalem, and people spread their garments and palms along the way, and they say, Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. But what Borg and Crossan suggest is that this was a pre-planned thing by Jesus, or by Mark's rendering of the story, pre-planned thing, that Jesus did this over and against the Roman authority, who on the other side of town were having a victory parade, a war victory parade coming in. So what Jesus's entry then becomes sort of an anti-imperialist parade into town, over and against the power of Rome. You have the humility of Jesus, who is hailed as a king in a way, yet over on the other side you have Pilate coming in, really being hailed as a king, right? So that was an interesting topic that we talked through last week, that idea of Jesus as being sort of a demonstration, in a way, sort of an anti-imperialist movement. He comes in to Jerusalem in that way. We didn't talk about this so much last week, but remember what is said in that passage. He comes into the city. We have the triumphal entry. He then goes into the temple and looks around, we're told. Then he departs with his disciples for Bethany for the night. And it's that the fact that he goes into the temple and looks around before he departs for Bethany is going to play an important part into the next day, into Monday. And today we're going to start with Monday, and hopefully we'll get into part of Tuesday of the week, okay? And for those who weren't with us last week, again, Mark's gospel is the one that really goes into the most detail as to which day of the week it is. And no, Mark doesn't call them, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but he dates them in other ways. So we know that the entry into Jerusalem is on Sunday. And then Mark will say things like the next day. All right, so we know that's Monday. And he'll even say in the morning or in the afternoon or in the evening, and then he'll say the next day. So now we know we're in Tuesday, right? And then he'll say, so he'll give these clues as to which day of the week it is. We assign that day of the week because we know that, well, that means it's Tuesday or it's Wednesday or it's Thursday. And so that's what we're going through, are the events of each day. And Candy, I think the Women's Bible Study actually studied this book. So you're probably familiar with some of this. You're muted out, so I can't hear you, but you can shake your head or nod your head.
Okay, we have not done the Borg book. We've done the Amy Jill book.
Okay, you've done the Amy Jill. All right, so I'm going to read from some of that too, the entering the Passion of Jesus. I'm going to use that as a source as well. So the last week is my main source. So does that kind of get everybody up to speed? So when we left off, Jesus and his disciples had left in the evening to go to Bethany, where they spent the night. And chances are they don't say this, but my guess and most people's guess would be, if they're going to Bethany to spend the night, they're going to stay with Martha and Mary and Lazarus in Bethany. So now we move to Monday, and we know it's Monday because Mark's gospel says that after Jesus entered Jerusalem, he went into the temple and then on to Bethany. Then we're told on the following day, when they came from Bethany. So the following day means the day after Sunday, so we know it's Monday. And remember last week, so for those of you who are new, you aren't going to remember this, but I'm going to tell you right now. We were given some history and context for Jesus's triumphal anti-imperialist entry into Jerusalem from the prophet Zechariah. So it was Zechariah who said that the Messiah would come on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And Marcus and Borg say it had to have been predetermined, because Jesus would have gone into the village and set it up to say, hey, there are going to be some people who are going to come for this donkey. I'm going to tie it up here. And when they ask for it, ask them why they want it. And they'll say, our Lord needs it. And then you'll give it to them and be like, okay. So, it's so easy when the disciples walk into the town and say, I need this donkey. And everyone just kind of goes, okay. And they take the donkey. So there's this thought that this was premeditated, that Jesus set this up. So Zechariah gives us some of that context. Now, as we go into Monday in Mark's gospel, we'll get some history and context from the prophet Jeremiah. When Monday begins, Mark gives us two stories that he wants us to link together. The story of the barren fig tree, and then the, quote, cleansing of the temple. And I quote cleansing because Borg and Crossan don't like that name for it, although most people refer to it as the cleansing of the temple. They don't like that word, and we'll get into that tonight. Borg and Crossan talk about these Markan frames, where Mark will use the start of one story, which they label A1, to lead to another story, which they label B, only to come back and close out the first story, and they label that A2. And Mark does this several times throughout his gospel. They are linked together, and Mark wants his listeners to know that and recognize that. Monday and Tuesday of the week bring us one of these frames. Jesus curses the fig tree, which is A1. Then we have the action in the temple, which is B. And then on Tuesday morning, the result of the fig tree, which is A2. So Jeff, you thought in our lectionary study we were done talking about the fig tree, but we aren't. And you're muted, so I can't hear your comments.
I had nothing really to say except that we'll never stop talking about the fig tree.
No, the fig tree always figures in, doesn't it? So that being said, what do we hear about the fig tree? Here's what the gospel says. On the following day, which we know now is Monday, when they came from Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple. And I'm going to stop right there. Jesus comes to the fig tree, and it's barren. Now, how many of you have any history with fig trees? Well, I lived in the South.
None.
Huh?
None.
None. So I lived in the South long enough to experience some fig trees. And fig trees, like any other tree, have their season of fruit, right? And what I'm going to read here, what I'm going to say to you is that we know that this is the month, the Hebrew month of Nisan, which is March or April, which means that would not be the time for the fruit to be out on the tree. And you know well enough here, if you grow anything that has fruit on it, it's not going to come out in March or April. It's going to come out later in the year. Well, I was saying it's true with the fig trees. The fruit doesn't come out. Now in the South, it probably came out starting in May, in June. But my wife's grandmother, who lived in Macon, Georgia, they had fig trees in their yard. And we would visit there, and I love figs. And I love to pull the figs right off the trees and peel them and eat them. And whenever I would come to visit, Beth's grandmother would get figs and she'd peel them for me. And Beth was always like, wow, she never peeled figs for anybody. So that's pretty special. But I identify with this in one sense. So Beth's parents have a lake house in Lincolnton, Georgia. And we used to go down there for Labor Day every year. And granted, Labor Day is obviously the end, it's harvest time, so it's going to be the end of the season. But I used to scour that fig tree, and fig trees are huge. And I would scour that fig tree for any sign of figs, and there'd be no figs to be found on it. And I used to go to Beth's mom and say, why are there never any figs? And she said, well, because when the figs come out, the birds take them all. I'm like, well, there's an easy way to fix that. When the figs come out, pick some figs and save them. She said, nope. So I lost that battle. But Jesus is going to the fig tree at this point, and he's mad, or it sounds like he's mad because it doesn't have figs, even though it's not the season for figs, as Mark tells us, right? Does that seem strange to anybody?
It does, except for the lesson that Jesus is trying to teach with the fig tree.
Which is what?
Well, I have it in my notes that that the tree professes to have fruit by having leaves, but it has no fruit. And so that which professes to have fruit but does not shall never provide fruit to anyone ever. That's so Jesus is sentencing those that profess to have fruit and never have it.
So how would that, if this is the start of one of Markin's frames, so that's leading us into what happened to the action in the temple. How do you think that might play a part in what happens in the temple?
Because the temple it has all the adornments that a temple should have, but it doesn't have any fruit for its people. It does not feed them.
So that is, yes, that's part of it. And that is going to play into it. Yes.
I can't explain the seasonal issue, of it not being in season, but I think it's just Mark telling a story about. That's what I have written about.
Right, and Jesus's words have nothing to do with the fact that it's not time for fruit to be on the tree. It has to do with the fact of what's about to happen. Yeah. So let me read what Borg and Crossan write here. Mark begins the Monday of Jesus's last week. Jesus and the disciples are coming from Bethany to Jerusalem. Hungry, Jesus sees a fig tree, and not finding any figs on it, pronounces a curse that it would never produce figs again, a curse the disciples hear. Next follows the incident in chapter 11, verses 15 through 19, which is usually misnamed as the cleansing of the temple, and sometimes cutely dismissed as Jesus's temple tantrum. Guess I've never heard that term before, but
I've never heard that.
And finally, on Tuesday, Mark concludes with, in the morning as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. So that concludes that framing. What Mark wants hearers or readers to consider are those two incidents go together. So that what happened to the fig tree and what happened in the temple interpret each other. Mark emphasizes two somewhat contradictory points about the fig tree. On the one hand, it was Passover week. The month was Nisan, or March to April to us, and there would never have been figs on that tree. Anyone and everyone would have known that, in Mark's words, it was not the season for figs. On the other hand, according to Mark, Jesus was hungry, expected to find figs, and having failed to do so, cursed the tree to permanent barrenness. Now, I like what they say here. The obvious contradiction between these two aspects of the incident is Mark's way of warning us to take the event symbolically rather than historically. Taken factually, Jesus is unreasonably petulant. Good word there. Jesus is unreasonably petulant, if not petulantly abusive, of his divine power. But taken as a parable, the fig tree's failure is a cipher for that of the temple. The framing fig tree warns us that the framed temple is not being cleansed, but symbolically destroyed, and that in both cases, the problem is a lack of the, quote, fruit that Jesus expected to be present. So there, Jeff, is where that comes in. But what exactly was wrong with the temple? Was Jesus's expectation for the temple every bit as strange as that for the fig tree? Was Jesus's action in the temple every bit as strange as that with the fig tree? So it's an interesting setup, isn't it? So Candy, this might sound familiar to you now, but I wanted to read something from Amy Jill Levine about the temple. Here's what we know about the actual setting of the temple itself. We begin by noting that the temple complex was enormous. It was the size of 12 soccer fields put end to end. So if Jesus turns over a table or two in one part of the complex, it's not going to make much of a difference given the size of the place. The action, therefore, did not stop all business. It is symbolic rather than practical. Our responsibility is to determine what was symbolized. For that, we need to know how the temple functioned. So before we get into that, let's hear the description of what Jesus actually did in the temple. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. How many of you know how the temple would have been set up? To get a picture of where Jesus is in all this, how Jesus fits in, what Jesus does, how that fits into the whole function of the temple. I mean, I don't expect you to know. I'm just wondering if anyone knows that.
Well, I do recall diagrams and paintings of how the temple, from Hebrew classes and history classes.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to give me a test on it today, I would probably fail. But there is sort of a large open entry area that you would go into that would be, you're broken off from the outside world. You're into a courtyard of such, but it's still not, you're in between places, in between worlds in a lot of ways. You're inside from the outside world, but you're not there to the temple yet.
Okay. Well, I mean, technically speaking, you're within the walls of the temple, but you're not to the holiest part of the temple.
I kind of remember that and I can't remember where I heard this, but that on the outside, kind of where Rick is talking about, is where the people are set up to sell and to do the exchanges and all that. So they're not in the physical body, in the inside church part, like worship space.
Right.
But they're right outside of there, kind of set up in my mind, and I've never seen a diagram. In my mind, they kind of look like right before you go into, like if there's something going on inside a building and you have those people set up outside to sell and do whatever. That's how I've always pictured it. Whether that's right or wrong, that's what I've had in mind.
So here's how Amy Jill Levine describes it. She says, "The Jerusalem temple, which King Herod the Great began to rebuild, and which was still under construction at the time of Jesus, had several courts. The inner sanctum, known as the Holy of Holies, is where the high priest entered only on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, so once a year, to ask for forgiveness for himself and for the people. Outside of that was the court of the priests, then the court of Israel, which my guess would be the court for the Jewish men, then the court of the women, and then the court of the Gentiles, who were welcome to worship in the temple. The outer court, the court of the Gentiles, is where the vendors sold their goods." So it is open for those to come in and worship within the confines of the temple. In that first place, the court of the Gentiles is where they would have been set up to sell these goods. So they would have been selling, it would have been completely legitimate things, right? They would have been selling animals for sacrifice. They would have been, the money changers would have been changing money, because remember, the temple tax had to be paid with, it could not be paid with Roman money.
It had to have been paid with shekels.
Right. It had to be paid with the appropriate money, which would have been, they wouldn't have had Caesar's imprint on it, which we'll get into later.
Mena partial shekel.
So, right.
It's the denominations.
So all that is legitimate business going on, right? So that has to happen. And you know that if you were coming to get an animal for sacrifice, the place you wanted to buy it was the temple, because then you would know that it was ritually pure, right? And so what would they, these sacrifices were done in a way, one thing that Borg and Crossan suggest is that Jesus is overthrowing the tables and doing all that in the temple had to do with blood sacrifices, which doesn't make sense, because these sacrifices of animals was a way to make this covenant with God. And you did it in one of two ways. You either you sacrificed the animal by burning the animal on the altar, which was an offering to God, holy and purely, or you sprinkled the blood on the altar, and then you cooked the animal and then ate it as if you were eating it with God, as an invitation to eat with God. And so both were, in the sacrifice of the animal, you were making the animal sacred. And so some will argue that Jesus was against that. No, I don't think Jesus was against that. And even they say Jesus wasn't against that. That was a legitimate practice in Judaism at that time, right? And typically it was probably doves, because it even says there were the tables where they sold the doves. That's probably what you were buying. So Jesus goes into the space and starts chasing people away, throwing them out, and says what he says. And so there's some concern as to why this happened. And the fig tree, the cursing of the fig tree, as we just read, sets up the fact that we have to take this not literally, but in a different way. And it sets up the action that Jesus does in the temple. So I'm going to go into that, but I want to set up another thing first before we go into that part of it. So stop me if you need to, if you have any questions at this point.
But doesn't the gospel refer to Jesus talking about robbers?
Well, he calls it a den of robbers.
Yeah. So maybe they're selling their product at exorbitant prices.
Well,
at the top.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that. No, that's not what that is getting at.
Ah.
No, in fact, and I'll expand out a little more on this in a minute, but it has to do with the fact that the den of robbers refers to not that they're doing something illegal in that spot. It's that they do illegal things in other places, and this is where they come for their sanctuary. It's where the robbers hang out after they've done their robbing. Does that make sense? So you're going to hear a real scathing bit I'm going to read here. I think it's Amy Jill Levine's about comparing it to modern day churchgoers. The idea that you can do whatever you want in the world, and yet you can come to the church for, quote, sanctuary, and that it's okay because you're there to worship and praise. That's what Jesus is getting at. You can't just use this as a place to escape the reality of what you're doing out in the world. Worship cannot take over justice. Does that make sense?
Plus, it was preventing.
Also, go ahead, Mark.
Wasn't it? It was preventing worship. We talked about this a little bit at the lectionary Bible study last night. The idea that, the court of the Gentiles, that was the only place certain folks could worship, and now they were being essentially shut out, which might explain why, Mark says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations," which is the only gospel which refers to it in that way. And so it was sort of preventing that from happening.
Well, the yes, but the truth of that is, and you're already moving forward in my notes here. The truth of
Sorry.
that is, in Jesus's day, that was not the case. Court of Gentiles was there. All nations were welcome. Ethnicities was the word that would be used in Greek, which means anyone outside the house of Israel, Gentile. But the reality is, when Mark writes the gospel, that was not happening. In Jesus' day, it was happening, so it doesn't really make sense that Jesus would say that. But what Mark wants you to hear 40 years later, when you're hearing it, is that that is the case we're under now. And then, in fact, the temple is destroyed in 70 AD, isn't it? So Mark is writing to his audience. But in Jesus's day, it wouldn't have made sense because, yeah, it was open. Anyone could come. So that's a distinction that Mark is trying to specifically for his hearers to understand. Does that make sense? So, but the other side of that is what Borg and Crossan call the ambiguity of the high priests and the ambiguity of the temple. That the position of high priest and the holiness of the temple had faded in so many ways and had become ambiguous in Mark's writing of the gospel. So the high priests originally were chosen for life until they died, and then someone else would take it. Well, when Rome comes in and takes power, Rome likes to dismiss high priests all the time, and they only serve at the pleasure of the Roman governor. So what you have is we talked last week about this domination system. What you have is a system where the Roman governor who is put over Jerusalem is looking over his shoulder at the emperor, being judged by the emperor, and then the high priest, who's supposed to have Jewish control over the city, the Jewish king, if you will, is looking over his shoulder at the Roman governor, who can fire him at any time. So it's not a system that's set up to work well. So now we're down to basically 4 families where the high priest can come from. So it's a very select group. And we've been in for years and years and years, we've been in this one particular family. And Caiaphas is the high priest, who was the son-in-law of Annas. And he actually was high priest for about 18 years, which was a really long time in those days. And the idea is he and Pilate probably got along pretty well. They would have had to have for him to have stayed in that position that long. But to the people, you're seeing the high priest go into the Holy of Holies on one day a year in Yom Kippur to make that sacrifice, the Day of Atonement. So you're serving God one day, but you're serving Rome the rest of the year, right? So the viewpoint from the people is that the Roman authority is bad, the high priest is bad, because they're not looking out for the people. Now, so here comes Jesus, who suddenly has all this authority and wisdom and does things to sort of shake up the complacency of the religious leaders, to say you can't just hide behind the fact that you're a high priest or you're an elder or you're a Pharisee or whatever and say that I'm fine because I do these things. No, you're not doing these things. That's what he came to shake up, and Mark is pointing that out, right? And the other gospels point that out too, but here Mark is particularly big on that confrontation and that challenge of Jesus against the religious authorities. So it starts here in the temple, where Jesus is saying you can't go out and do these atrocious things and there not be justice, and yet you hide as if you're worshiping and that's going to take care of it. No, that's not the case. And he goes in and he throws everybody out. But the interesting thing you have to remember is that on the night before, he went into the temple. So he sort of scoped it out to look at what was going to happen, because he knew what he was going to do the next day. That's what Borg and Crossan are saying. That's what they're saying Mark is telling us. Jesus knew he was going to come back the next day and do this. Everybody with me so far?
Yep.
All right, so I want to read this. So this is where we get into the Jeremiah section. Jeremiah giving us some history and context, because Jeremiah set up kind of the same thing in chapters 7 and 26 of his book, that there was a low regard of the temple and of the religious authority at this time, right? So this is out of Borg and Crossan. In Jeremiah 7, God tells Jeremiah to stand in front of the temple and confront those who enter to worship. About what? About their false sense of security. They're clinging to the refrain, "This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord," indicates that they are taking it for granted that God's presence in the temple guarantees the security of Jerusalem and their own security as well. Do you think, charges God through Jeremiah, that divine worship excuses you from divine justice? That all God wants is regular attendance at God's temple rather than equitable distribution of God's land? And here is the accusation. If you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly with one another, if you do not oppress the alien, the orphan, and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not go after other gods to your own hurt, then I will dwell with you in this place, in the land that I gave of old to your ancestors forever and ever. Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? So that's what Mark is pulling from. In that context, the meaning of the phrase den of robbers is very clear. The people's everyday injustice makes them robbers, and they think the temple is their safe house, den, hideaway, or place of security. The temple is not the place where the robbery occurs, but the place where the robbers go for refuge. Jeremiah, of course, is not inventing anything new with that indictment. There was an ancient prophetic tradition in which God insisted not just on justice and worship, but on justice over worship. God had repeatedly said, "I reject your worship because of your lack of justice," but never, ever, ever, "I reject your justice because of your lack of worship." And then later in chapter 26, Jeremiah will give the threat that if people do not turn from evil and do not heed the words of the prophets, then God will destroy this temple. And in fact, what we see is Jesus, in effect, destroying the temple, although it's only a section of the temple, so it doesn't disrupt everything else that goes on. It's symbolic. It's a symbolic destruction of the temple, right? But here's the scathing words that I want you to hear from Amy Jill Levine. Jeremiah 7 depicts the ancient prophet as condemning the people of his own time, the time right before Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple over 500 years earlier. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and go after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, "We are safe," only to go on doing all these abominations? Some people in Jeremiah's time, and at the time of Jesus, and today, take divine mercy for granted and see worship as an opportunity to show off new clothes rather than recommit to clothing the naked. The present day comparison to what Jeremiah and Jesus condemned is easy to make. The church member sins during the work week, either by doing what is wrong or by failing to do what is right. Then on Sunday morning, this same individual, perhaps convinced of personal righteousness, heartily sings the hymns, happily shakes the hands of others, and generously puts a $50 bill in the collection plate. That makes the church a den of robbers, a cave of sinners. It becomes a safe place for those who are not truly repentant and who do not truly follow what Jesus asks. The church becomes a place of showboating, not of fishing for people. That's a harsh description, isn't it? But that's exactly what Mark's point is. The fig tree wasn't bearing fruit. It was a symbol for the temple not bearing fruit because people were hiding out in the temple thinking that the worship was going to save them from the other atrocities they were doing out in the world. Now, obviously, that's not saying that applies to everybody, does it? And they're not saying that that applies to everybody. Certainly we know that. But it's a symbolic note for the readers and hearers of Mark's gospel after the destruction of the temple to understand why Jesus acted the way he did. Thoughts at this point?
I knew there was a reason that when I was a child, I shouldn't have to dress up to go to church.
It's funny what people can take from the Bible, Jim. Den of Thieves in King James version, right? Den of Thieves is the translation in King
Yeah,
James.
in fact, later Borg and Crossan will later say, robbers is not the best translation. It's better translated as bandits or brigands or rebels. The book I have from Chris Bryan, my English New Testament professor, he uses brigands.
Yeah, like
very English.
Like as if they have false authority.
Right. Or the Borg and Crossan even goes so far as to call them insurrectionists.
One of the things that with the prayer we said earlier, wasn't it? Didn't we say it earlier? It was a general Thanksgiving or something like that, that has a little bit in it about not only with our lips, but in our lives. That sort of is the antithesis of what we're talking about.
Yeah. We profess our faith not only with our lips, but in our lives, by giving up ourselves to your service and by walking before you in holiness all the days of our lives. Yep. And it has to make you think that it makes me think that when I do things in the work week that are probably not the right thing to do, and I'm not talking about heinous, awful things, but even little things, that when I'm in worship, that doesn't protect me. I need to ask for forgiveness, right? I need to confess that fault and ask for forgiveness. And if I've grieved somebody, I need to ask their forgiveness. So that's the setup for Jesus going in and doing what he does. Now, what's interesting is Mark's gospel says it in a way that makes it sound like the teaching he does after throwing anything out kind of gives his explanation for why he did it. Unfortunately, Mark doesn't give us that explanation. It just says Jesus taught and said these things, right? So now you understand why the religious authorities are so afraid of him, because the crowds just clung to him. He did all this, and then he said, this is why I'm doing it. And they all were mesmerized by his teaching. And now the religious authority didn't know what they could do. And in fact, that's what happens. The events that happen right after this are those series of challenges from the religious authority who fear the crowd, fear what they might do if they call Jesus out, right?
Now this may be a bit of a stretch, but a couple pages later, Jesus again invokes another fig tree analogy, another parable. And I think it's interesting to think about Jesus as a fig tree without leaves, without adornments, but with the fruit.
Yeah. So, well, when he comes out of the temple, or the next morning, they see the fig tree withered, which
But
sort
then
of
there's
concludes
another.
it. But then,
Yeah.
Later he says, "From the fig tree, learn its lesson."
Right.
So he's just hearkening them back to what they've already witnessed. But he continues to use that analogy.
Because the fig tree in that later parable is not so much the lesson of the fig tree here is that it is summer. The shoots are green. He will come. He is coming. It will happen and it will happen. The whole world will fall away, but my words will remain.
And then you get into the keep awake, because you do not know the day that it will happen, right? Yeah. And we're coming to that. That's still on. That sort of concludes the Tuesday thing. But now we're still in. But yes, that will happen. So now we're still in Monday. But that's all that happens, because then Jesus leaves again in the evening. presumably back to Bethany, but we're not told that specifically, but we're just told he leaves that evening and then comes back. On the way back the next morning, they see the fig tree. It's now Tuesday morning, and they see that it's withered, and Peter remembers what Jesus had done the day before. And then Jesus says, talks about moving mountains, of faith moving mountains. And we'll get into that next time as we start Tuesday, because we're almost at 8 o'clock.
I was just looking back at Jeremiah, and in 24, there's a whole chapter called The Good and Bad Figs.
Ah, well, there you go. Maybe that's why I love figs so much. In Genesis, when they talk about Adam and Eve, after they eat from the tree of good and evil and they learn they're naked, they sew leaves together to cover themselves, right? So when I was in my Anheuser-Busch days, I was working on a sports contract with a minor league hockey team in Columbus, Georgia. No, in Macon, Georgia. In Macon, Georgia, a minor league hockey team. And fig trees are abundant in Macon. And so they decided the hockey team was going to be called the Macon Whoopee. And I suggested their logo should be a fig leaf. And I don't know that it had any bearing, and I don't remember what they did with it, but I thought that would have been appropriate.
They probably didn't do that.
They probably did not do that. All right, folks. So we'll pick up next week with Tuesday, and we'll see how far we get. How's